Hey, good evening. Ron here. Um, let's get started. If you're coming back this week, you might have been hoping there'd be a guest with me again this week. Um, there will not be a guest this week. I'll be having a guest once every month. I'm shooting for the third Tuesday of the month, but that may fluctuate a little bit depending on the schedule of the guests that I have lined up. We have guests scheduled for the next couple months. Coming up in October, I'll give you just a little bit of information about what's going on. Coming up in October, I have some video posts coming up on my page that are going to be dealing with pornography and unhealthy sexual behavior, sex addiction. I'm a certified addiction recovery coach. I've been working with men for going on 40 years, right at 40 years in the area of drug and alcohol recovery. But I've been working for the past 8 years or so with men in the area of sex addiction, pornography, and unhealthy sexual behavior. Coming up in October, my guest will be a coach who works with women with spouses, girlfriends in the area of betrayal trauma. And I'm not going to dive into that much if you're not familiar with that concept. For years, the spouses, significant others of men who struggled with prostitution, with acting out sexually, unhealthy sexual behavior, their spouses were treated as being codependent. And to be honest, there wasn't a lot of success experienced with that treatment approach. But a number of years ago, through studies, it was discovered that women whose husbands are unfaithful through actually acting out with other partners, or even in the area of pornography, that women experience something that's a lot closer to PTSD, and thus the phrase betrayal trauma. And the guest I'll have next month works with women in that area, and we'll be discussing that, how our spouses are affected by our unhealthy sexual behavior, by a man's unhealthy sexual behavior. And then coming up in November, the plan is to have a friend of mine who is a long-term chaplain, long-term pastor, but he is certified in the area of spiritual direction. We're going to be talking about the role that faith plays in our recovery. So those are a couple of things that are coming up tonight. You're stuck just with me. Last week it was my daughter, Elizabeth Williams. We discussed the role that isolation plays in our addiction, and the role of healthy community in our recovery. And glad everybody came out last week for the interaction that took place. This week, we're going to be talking about guilt. Again, thanks everybody for joining. When you jump in, if you don't mind, in the comments, if you could just post where you're checking in from, I'd appreciate that. It gives me an idea of where we are reaching people and how people are responding. So, guilt. What is it? How does it show up in recovery? And how can we respond to guilt in a healthy way? Those are some of the questions that we're going to be talking about tonight. Also in the comments tonight, as you join, if you have any specific thoughts on guilt, what comes to mind when you hear that word? What's your experience been like with guilt? Is it something that haunts you? Is it something that you try to avoid, that you try to run from and hide from? We're going to talk about some of these things this evening. But first of all, I want to begin by defining guilt. And I'm going to start by talking about the difference between guilt and shame. A lot of people talk about this, but what we're looking at is with the idea of guilt, we're experiencing the result of having done something wrong. Guilt would equal I did something wrong. And shame, on the other hand, takes that guilt and twists it to I am something wrong. Yeah, I see that, Glass. It used to haunt me a lot too, and it can still pop up in my life. I can still experience guilt, and we're going to talk about that from a number of angles this evening. And so I want to start just by touching on, for some of you that have listened to me in the past or have been around me, you'll know that I work a lot with my clients on feelings. And my approach to feelings is I believe that our feelings were created by God. The Bible's filled with feelings, especially books like Psalms, which is just chapter after chapter of people processing out loud, sometimes in painful ways, the feelings and the emotions that they're struggling with. And so I believe our feelings were created by God. And I believe that with each of our feelings, there is a healthy response to that feeling and a gift that's available. And I also believe there's an impairment or an unhealthy response. And most of us are experts on the unhealthy response. At least I'll say that's where I've always lived, is in the unhealthy response to my feelings. And I believe this is true of guilt also. Now, a little catchphrase that I use a lot is that behind every behavior is a feeling, and behind every feeling is a need. And when we think about our behaviors like that, what we see is that for most of us that struggle with addiction, we focus on the behavior because the behavior is what causes us the pain. And it's what causes the pain and the problems for the people around us. And so we focus on the behavior, whether that's drugs or alcohol, whether it's sexual behavior, even things like overeating or overspending or whatever it may be. And so we focus on the behavior, but behind that behavior is a number of feelings that are present. And behind those feelings are a need. Now with guilt, the unhealthy response to guilt when we experience it, most of us will move towards toxic shame or towards pride. And this is what that looks like. We feel guilt, we experience guilt, and we begin to sink into the thought and the idea that I'm just screwed up. I'm just broken. I'm just always hurting other people. I'm always causing pain. I'm always causing harm. Toxic shame. Or we move towards pride in that unhealthy response. And the way that pride demonstrates itself in that unhealthy response is we begin to rationalize and justify what we've done. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a few minutes. Now, the gift that's available from guilt, with guilt, when we're able to press into that feeling and process that feeling in a healthy way, the gift that's present is freedom. And the need that's behind that feeling is forgiveness. What we're looking for is we're looking for forgiveness. Now, have you, when you experience guilt, is guilt something that you enjoy? Is it something that you like? Is it something that you look forward to? Well, I can't wait until the next time I feel guilty. That's not the response that most of us have when faced with guilt. And so guilt often shows up in recovery because of and through past choices that we've made, trust that we've broken with a friend, with a spouse, a significant other, with our children, with our family. And guilt shows up through lost opportunities and lost relationships. We experience guilt. Now, what I want to present today is that when we feel guilt, when that feeling is present, guilt invites us to ask ourselves 3 questions. And those 3 questions help us to dive in and identify what's taking place and how we need to respond. And we're going to talk about those 3 questions, and then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about false guilt, what that is, and how do we identify that and respond to that. But 3 questions that guilt invites us to ask. And those 3 questions are, number 1, have I violated my morals? Have I done something that violates my personal morals and my beliefs? Question number 2 is, have I violated God's morals? Or that may even be if I feel that I've violated society's morals. And then question number 3 is, have I caused harm? And when we ask that question, we need to examine that from 2 directions. Have I caused harm intentionally, or have I caused harm unintentionally? We can cause harm without meaning to and still experience guilt because of that when we recognize what has taken place and what's going on. So, have I violated my morals? Maybe my personal morals are dictate that I need to be honest, I need to be truthful, I need to be faithful, I should not steal. And we do something that violates our personal morals. And this produces guilt in us. Have I violated God's morals? For some of us, for many of us, we may, AA talks about, Bill W. talks about that spiritual experience that's involved in recovery. And many of us have some sort of spiritual foundation in our life and in our recovery. And we have things that we believe are just by nature right and wrong. Kind of that concept of do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And so we want to do what's right. We want to do what's good for ourselves and others. And so have we violated that? Again, have I been dishonest with somebody? Have I been just mean? There have been times, just recently, I was in a coffee shop. I spend a lot of time in a coffee shop, and I was becoming frustrated, and I became a little rude with a woman that was in the coffee shop. And I experienced guilt. I recognized that I had violated both my morals, my desire to be kind, and I believe God's morals. and I experienced the guilt. So how do I respond to that? And then that third, have I caused harm? Now, here's the thing with causing harm to other people. Like I said a minute ago, it can be intentional or it can be unintentional. Sometimes we cause harm and we do it in our frustration or in our anger, and we say something or we do something that hurts somebody else. And we recognize what we've done, and we experience guilt. Now, in that unhealthy response to guilt, which is what I'm most used to, when I experience that guilt, I either move towards toxic shame, that idea of I am just never going to change. I'm always going to be a failure. I'm always going to hurt other people. Or we move towards pride, and pride expresses itself as self-justification, self-righteousness. And our response to guilt is to tell ourselves, well, they deserved it. They shouldn't have gotten in the way. They shouldn't have slowed me down or caused me a problem. And we move towards pride, towards self-justification as an unhealthy response to guilt. And so with those three questions, when we identify that we have answered yes to one or more of those three questions, then how do we respond to that? How do we respond to our guilt in a healthy way? And I'm going to make a few suggestions here. We'll walk through these. And if you have any examples or any comments on anything that I'm sharing here, put that into the chat. I'd be interested in hearing what you think. I do need to let you know there is a delay between me speaking and you hearing me. And so you could put something into the chat, and it may take me somewhere between 15 to 30 seconds for me to see that. But I'd be interested in knowing what you think. So when we experience guilt and we have answered yes to one of our three questions, how do we respond to that? Well, we begin by acknowledging it honestly. And instead of denying or minimizing, we need to step up and we need to face what we've done. And being able to name that harm that we've caused or that moral that we have violated, when we're able to name that, when we're able to step up, speak that out and confess it, naming that takes the power away from shame, and it shuts down that movement toward shame and that idea that I'm broken and that I'm never going to be able to change. Being able to recognize what I've done acknowledges I see that and change is possible. So we begin by honestly acknowledging what we've done. We own it. We step up. We're honest. A second step, a second response to guilt might be to seek understanding. Now, what does that mean and what does that look like? Well, we need to stop and ask ourselves, why did I act that way? What need was present there that I was responding to? Was I responding to fear, or was a mistaken belief driving me? Was I responding to anger in an unhealthy way? What was behind my action and that harm that I caused, or that moral position that I violated? What was present there? Maybe we were responding in fear. Maybe we were responding in anger. And we snapped and we lashed out. We said or did something. What was that need? If we can begin to understand and see, recognize why, What is the why behind the way that we're responding? Then this helps us to prevent repeating that same mistake over again. Now, I'll throw out there too, with these steps, and as we process and work through these things, a lot of times in responding and processing my feelings, it's really good for me to write things down. It's good for me to journal my responses to these. I was talking with somebody today that was shooting me some texts. We were texting back and forth, and he was processing some disappointment that's in his life. And I shared that I'd been processing some things recently, and that old AA phrase, maybe you're familiar with this, that expectation is premeditated resentment. And I had recognized that in my life, that I had expectations of others that were unrealistic and that were unfair. And those expectations were moving into resentment. And it was causing me to respond with anger. It was causing me to say and to think things that weren't right, that were not truthful and honest. And that produced guilt in my life. And so as we're able to process these, write things out, work through them, we're able to see and to understand better, and to process in a way that allows us to avoid slipping into the same unhealthy pattern in the future. So step number 3, step number 1 is acknowledge what we've done honestly. Number 2 is to seek understanding. Step number 3 would be to take responsibility. Now, what we've got to be careful to avoid is that we don't slide into self-condemnation. And that's an easy step as we begin to move forward and to take responsibility for our behavior, for our actions, for those things that are causing us to feel guilt. We have to be careful that we don't slide into self-condemnation. That's not a healthy step. Responsibility is about ownership. It's about admitting to myself, this is what I did. Responsibility is not about endless self-punishment. And some of us, I'm one of those people. I've had periods in my life where that has been my response. Endless self-punishment, where I move into a cycle of just beating myself up continuously because of things that I've done in the past that have produced guilt. Guilt is intended to be a teacher. Guilt is never intended to be a life sentence. And so if you find yourself walking around always feeling guilt, then things aren't being processed well. Things aren't being handled in a healthy way. Guilt is a teacher, not a life sentence. So we take responsibility for what we've done. We own it. Number 4, when possible, make amends. Do what we can to make things right, to set things right. This may mean an apology. And if that's what's required, then we apologize sincerely. But it needs to go further than that. It may mean that we need to repair the harm. If we have taken something, we need to replace it. If we have lashed out and caused harm, we need to do what we can to repair that harm that's been caused. And that's probably going to involve changing our behavior moving forward. So sometimes that means a direct apology. Other times it means living differently moving forward. It means that we do what's necessary to change the way that we think, to change the way that we react, so that we don't repeat the same actions and the same behaviors in the future. So we make amends when possible. Number 5, I have 6 things listed here. Number 5, learn and grow from it. All of us will do things wrong. If we're in recovery, most of us will experience relapse at some point, especially early on. This only becomes failure when we fail to grow, when we fail to learn from it. Guilt becomes productive. It becomes a good thing when it leads to change. When we stop and process, why am I feeling this guilt? What's taken place? What have I done to produce this guilt in my heart and in my mind? And then we put things in place to bring about change. We need to ask ourselves questions like, how can I act more in line with my values next time a situation like this comes up? How can I be more that person that I desire to be? How can I see to it that I don't cross this line again? And then number 6, we need to release it after we make things right. Once we've taken responsibility for our behavior, once we've taken responsibility and made amends, continuing to hold on to guilt shifts into false guilt. And at that point, forgiveness of ourselves and from others is key. Being able to let go of what we've done once we have done all that we can to correct it and to make things right. So in short, we need to acknowledge what we've done. We need to take ownership. We need to understand and dig in. We need to ask the question, why did I do this? Were there other feelings that was behind it? Was I angry? Was I fearful? Was I hurt in some way? And I responded in a way that was unhealthy. We take responsibility, we make amends, and then we release it and we let it go. We don't hang on to it. The wound can heal and we can move forward in a healthy way. Now, I want to stop for a minute and I want to consider the idea of false guilt. And let me begin by saying that we have to be careful as we think about and as we discuss false guilt, because that false guilt, turning and assuming that the guilt that we're feeling is false, can be a part of that unhealthy reaction, that self-justification, where we're looking for an excuse to take us off the hook for what we've done. And we have to be careful that we don't slide into that. So false guilt is when we feel guilty, even though we haven't actually done anything wrong, or the responsibility that we're carrying isn't really ours. And false guilt can be caused by several factors. So let's take a look at some of those. False guilt can come as a result of unrealistic standards. Many times we hold ourselves to impossible expectations. Perfectionism. That idea that I should never mess up. I should never struggle. I should never fall short. And when you have those thoughts, those are always going to be unrealistic, and they're going to be impossible to live up to. Many times when I'm working with people and they're walking through harms and things that they've caused in their addiction or in their past, and they'll be discussing and beating themselves up over these things, and they'll make statements like, I just can't forgive myself. I just can't forgive myself. And many times I'll stop and I'll reframe the story in a little different way. Maybe they have children, and I'll ask them, what if your son did this? Would you beat him up, and would you tell him that he's a failure for life? That he is forever going to be a disappointment to you? That he is forever going to be a failure because of what took place here? And almost without exception, the response is no, absolutely not. No, they can turn things around and they can change. And so the question becomes then, why don't you allow yourself that grace? Why don't you exercise that grace with yourself? A lot of times when we're talking to friends or to family members, people that we care about, we'll talk to them and use phrases like, you're not a bad person. You can get over this. This is not you. You made a mistake. Let's get up, let's make things right, and let's move forward. But we have a totally different set of standards for ourselves. And that's unrealistic. And that is false guilt. False guilt. And we have to avoid that. It's back to that saying I mentioned a minute ago. Expectations lead to expectations are premeditated resentments. And when we set unrealistic expectations for ourselves, we begin to build resentment towards ourselves. False guilt can also come from, excuse me, false guilt can also come from childhood conditioning. Growing up in environments and in families where love or approval was tied to performance or to obedience or to keeping other people happy. And many of us have experienced these kind of things in our childhood. Maybe you've heard phrases when you're growing up, you're such a disappointment. Why can't you do anything right? You're just never going to succeed. And yet we hear stories all the time in the business world about people who are really successful, who were told those things as children, and that became motivation for them to exceed expectations. For many of us, though, we hear these things and we carry these things with us. They become a burden and a load that's strapped to our back. I was always told I was never going to succeed. I was always told, why do you have to be the bad one? And we carry that and we view life through that lens. When we ask, going back to those three questions, when we ask, have I violated my morals or my values? Have I violated God's morals or values? Have I caused harm? And the question is no. We can't identify clearly where those things have taken place. False guilt, and it may stem from childhood conditioning. Some of us have people-pleasing tendencies. We've grown up in environments where we feel responsible for other people's emotions or problems, even when they are outside of our control. Again, and some of these things are related to things like attachment styles. and things of that nature, where we maybe grew up in a home where our parents looked to us for emotional regulation. And so we may have become people pleasers. And I've got news. Not everybody's going to be happy all the time. And when they're not, that's not your fault. You're not responsible for that. False guilt can come from a misinterpretation of beliefs, twisting spiritual, cultural, or moral teachings into self-blame. Well, if something went wrong, it had to be my fault. I had to be the weak link in the picture. False guilt can come from trauma or abuse. Survivors of trauma or abuse, whether that's physical or sexual or emotional trauma, survivors of trauma and abuse often internalize blame for what happened, even though they weren't at fault. Sometimes that comes through things that are told to us while the abuse is taking place. You know, it's your fault that I have to beat you like this. If you weren't so bad, I wouldn't have to do this to you. Or in cases of sexual abuse, I hear all the time where the abuser makes statements like, you know, you like this. You want it. You really want it. And we internalize these things, and they generate guilt inside of us. We begin to believe lies that we've been told and lies that have come through experiences that we've had. False guilt may come from fear of conflict or rejection, feeling guilty simply for saying no. Have you ever experienced that? Has somebody ever asked you to do something and you already have plans, you already have a commitment, and you need to say no, but you become overwhelmed with guilt? I've done that before many times myself, where I end up overcommitting. I commit to so many things, I can't possibly accomplish it all. And I'm doing that from a motivation of guilt. Sometimes that guilt may be placed on me in part by an external person, another person, but many times it comes from me and just the belief that I should be able to do everything. I should be able to meet everybody else's need, and that my needs take second place. So fear of conflict or rejection, for saying no, for setting boundaries. Boundaries are healthy things. Or for prioritizing our own needs. And I have news for you. Your needs are valid. Your needs are valid. You need to take care of yourself. You need to. You can't care for other people if you're not caring for yourself. And then the last one that I'll touch on here, false guilt can come from comparison and from shoulds, measuring yourself against others or against imagined standards, and then feeling guilty for not matching them. We set standards for ourselves that are unrealistic. I have historically been terrible about setting standards that I should be able to do anything. We had plumbing problems at the house. Well, I should know how to take care of that, or I should be able to do it. And even things today in our society like YouTube videos can really add to that sense of guilt and comparison and shoulds. Well, you should be able to find a video that shows you how to do it. And sometimes we can do that. Just last weekend, a friend and I were putting brakes on my truck. To be honest, my friend did 99% of the work. I was handing tools, but we were putting brakes on the back, brakes on my pickup truck, and we were using YouTube videos to make sure that we were doing it right. And that was a good thing. But that can also cross a line where we all of a sudden believe that we should be able to do everything because there's a video for it, or because I just should be able to do that. And we slide into false guilt. So false guilt is usually about perceived responsibility. It's not actual wrongdoing. False guilt can even come in areas like at work, where a job or an assignment hasn't been explained properly, and you're working, doing the best that you know how to in the situation, and things don't go right. And a boss, sometimes knowing that they didn't explain things properly, will come and will begin to heap guilt. Well, you should have known how to do that. But the truth is, they should have explained the process. And so we experience false guilt. So false guilt, again, is about perceived responsibility, not actual wrongdoing. It's more about how we interpret a situation than it is about what truly happened. And we need to be aware of that and conscious of our ability to slide into that way of thinking, or about our likelihood sometimes to slide into that. A lot of times it's easier for me to assume and just to tell myself, well, it's your fault. It's easier for me sometimes to do that than to place actual responsibility on a person that I care about, or somebody that I respect or love. And so, yeah, it's a little bit about false guilt and how we respond to that, how we recognize that. We need to recognize that, and we need to step away from it. So, a couple more things, and I'll begin to wrap up. I want to look for a minute at the unhealthy side of guilt. When guilt becomes toxic or shifts to shame, or becomes constant, it begins to weigh down our recovery. We begin to believe that recovery isn't possible. We're just not able to do it. Signs of unhealthy guilt may be when we just dwell on our potential for failure, or we begin to focus and dwell on past mistakes that we've made. Another sign of unhealthy guilt is self-punishment, when we begin to beat ourselves up for what's taking place or what we expect to take place. And we begin to slide into a spot where we feel stuck, where we feel like progress is just not possible. Some links that are present there with guilt to a risk of relapse are things like the idea that guilt can lead to shame. And a lot of times in our feelings, they're always progressing. They're moving from one level or one stage to another. And so we may begin with a sense of guilt. Maybe the guilt is valid, maybe it's false. But instead of pressing into it, evaluating it, following the steps that we talked about earlier to deal with guilt in a healthy way and to learn from it, we begin to slide into shame. And in shame, we begin to move further until we enter into despair. And that results in us giving up. There's never a reason in our recovery for us to give up. There's never. a reason for us to give up. So I would invite you, whether you're watching this live this evening or whether you're watching this video when it's posted on my social media in the future, I would invite you in the comments to share a personal story of your own or an example of guilt. You know, guilt has played a big role in my addiction. Beginning to give into things with my addiction, seeing the pain that I'm causing to myself and to the people that I care about, and then rather than pressing into that guilt and using that in a healthy way to push me towards recovery, towards making things right, towards making amends and moving forward in a healthy way, I have allowed that guilt to push me further into attempts to escape my feelings. And escaping our feelings are never the right move, never. When we experience feelings, even those feelings that we would classify as bad feelings, those feelings are meant to be pressed into. They can provide us with a plan, with a vision, with wisdom to move forward and to experience the gift that's available as we process those feelings in a healthy way. And so, real quick, a few tools for handling guilt in recovery. And we've touched on some of these already, but I'll go back and highlight a few of these again. An important tool for handling guilt in recovery is self-compassion. We need to treat ourselves with the same kindness, the same compassion that we give to a friend. It can be beneficial for me to stop and ask myself the things that you're telling yourself in your head right now, the way that I'm beating myself up. Is that what I would tell my friend? Is that what I'd tell one of my daughters if they were in the same place? Is that what I would tell somebody that I work with? Most of the time, it's not. I tend to be much harder on myself than I am on other people, especially people that I care about. And that makes an important statement about me because I need to care for myself. So self-compassion, the same kindness that I'd give to a friend. We need to make amends and apologies. And those two things are different. Amends and apologies are different. Amends is when we do something to make right the harm we've caused. An apology is a verbal statement. I'm sorry. Amends is generally an action. And so guilt turns into healing when we take action. When we step up, own what we've done, own the harm that's present, and we take action to correct things and to make things right. Boundaries. Not carrying false guilt that doesn't belong to us. Not allowing other people to setting a boundary. I'm not going to accept responsibility from other people for things that I haven't caused, for things that are not my issue. We establish boundaries. We set boundaries and we hold to those boundaries. And then spiritual faith, spiritual faith practices. Things like prayer, meditation, forgiveness. Prayer is beneficial in that it helps us to recognize and to turn to our higher power. or God. Prayer helps me to recognize and to realize that I'm not facing things on my own. Meditation. Through meditation, I'm able, many times through meditation, to take a long look at what has taken place. Did I really do something wrong in this instance? Meditation can help me to determine whether what I'm experiencing is real, valid guilt or whether it's false guilt. And then forgiveness. It's important for us to receive forgiveness. It's also extremely important for us to give forgiveness. We can't always expect other people to forgive us for our shortcomings if we're not willing to forgive others. So prayer, meditation, and forgiveness. And again, here's a question for you to meditate on. What's one tool? Can you identify a tool that you have used to work through guilt? Can you identify something that's worked for you in the past? If you're struggling with that, then maybe you need to go back and look at some of the things we've talked about here tonight and identify some tools that have been presented that you can begin to use. So, in summarizing, as I'm closing here tonight, I have two main points that I want us to think about. First of all, guilt can be healthy or guilt can be toxic. And we make that decision as to what it's going to be. Is it guilt going to be something where I'm able to turn to those questions? Have I violated my values, my morals, my principles? Have I violated God's values, morals, or principles? Or have I caused harm in some way? Even if it was accidental, even if I didn't intend to, have I caused harm? We take a look at those questions, we ask those questions, and we press in. And guilt can be healthy. Guilt can also be toxic when we begin to become consumed by it, when we allow that guilt to turn into toxic shame. I'm just always going to be a failure. I'm always going to cause harm. And I'm here to tell you today that is a lie. That only becomes true when you create that truth in your life by failure to press in and take action. My second main point today is it's what we do with guilt that matters. It's how we respond to it. Do we allow ourselves to become overwhelmed by it? Or do we press into it? And do we respond in a healthy way? Do we own and take responsibility for what we've done? Do we seek to understand why we acted in that way? Do we make amends whenever that's possible? Do we consider how we can grow from the mistakes that we've made? And then do we release it after we've walked through these steps? We can take that guilt and we can respond to it and we can grow. That's what matters. So here's my question for you, another question for you to think about this week. Is my guilt, and all of us experience guilt at certain times. Guilt is normal. Is my guilt pointing me towards growth, or is it keeping me stuck? Is it pointing me towards growth, or is it keeping me stuck? And if it's keeping me stuck, how do I need to respond to that? What do I need to change about how I respond to the guilt when I experience it? So, in closing tonight, I'm going to issue a couple of invitations. If you haven't done so yet, I'd invite you to follow me here on this platform. And I would invite you, you can respond if you have questions or comments. You can respond in the comments here, or you can feel free to connect with me personally by email. You can email me at rwcoaching2@gmail.com. Man, I'd be happy to hear from you. I'd like to know any questions or any thoughts that you have on guilt. What do you use with guilt that's been beneficial for you? Do you have any questions about whether or not the way that you're responding to guilt and processing it is healthy? Feel free to send me those questions. I'd love to interact and discuss those things with you. And again, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, whether it's here in the live stream or whether you're watching this on one of my social media platforms in the weeks or months after I've been here tonight. So thank you guys for being here. And I hope that you have a good evening. And again, the next time you feel that guilt creeping into your life, ask yourself those 3 questions. Have I violated my morals or my values? Have I violated God's morals or values? And have I caused harm? When you ask those questions, if you need help processing them, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to talk. Have a good evening.